Hello and welcome to Social Capital, APLU's Commission on Innovation, Competitiveness, and Economic Prosperity, or CISEP, is excited to present this new series of webinars exploring what makes innovation ecosystems work. In the series, we're looking at university partnerships with industry, with government, and with communities. We're examining those partnerships from every angle and taking a look at how partners build trust and cooperate to achieve shared goals. We'd like to thank Florida International University's Office of Engagement for helping us out with this webinar, providing the webinar platform and production support. We'd also like to say thanks to all of you who've joined us. We're glad you're taking some time out of your day to join the conversation. I'm Jim Waddell, your host for Social Capital. I'm Assistant Vice President for Innovation and Technology Policy at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, and I'm also the Staff Director for the Commission on Innovation. Today's program is called Convening the Conveners, Working with Economic Development Organizations. We know that universities can play a convening role in economic development, bringing stakeholders together to advance regional goals. As they do, they would be wise to follow the lead of economic development organizations who are out there working every single day to convene partners as champions for economic growth. So how can universities best partner with economic developers? How do we capitalize on the experience and focus of these organizations? What role does state government play in promoting partnerships between economic developers and universities? How does a focus on place help joint efforts among us? And how do we find shared measures of success? Let's find out. Before I introduce my first guest, though, I'd like to invite all of you to participate in the conversation just by typing your questions or ideas or thoughts into the chat window. I'll definitely be looking for those questions to come in, and a little later on in the program we'll have an opportunity to discuss your questions. But for now, I'm going to introduce our first guest. Eileen Walker is the Chief Executive Officer of the Association of University Research Parks, or AURP. This organization fosters innovation, commercialization, and economic growth in a global economy through university, industry, and government partnerships. The organization is comprised of university research, science, and tech parks from all around the world. Eileen regularly consults with universities and their research parks regarding best practices. Recently, she was tapped by the United States Department of State and the William Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board to serve as a Fulbright specialist to advise universities across the world in their university research park planning. She directed the Arizona State University Research Park in Tempe, Arizona for many years and has served as a member of the Board of the Directors for AURP, as an Executive Officer of the Arizona Bioindustry Association, and the Board of Directors of Habitat for Humanity, Tucson. Eileen, thanks so much for joining us today. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'm really excited about sharing some information and learning more from everybody on the call about this. I think it's really an important subject and one that we can always do better at.
Great, thanks, Eileen. I know that you have some thoughts you'd like to share with us right to kick off, so why don't you go ahead and jump into those, and then we'll get to some questions.
Great. Well, Iris, we could take a look at the slides 7 through 14. You know, the first thing that we're talking about here is how do universities work well with economic developers? And I would say that, you know, as partnerships, that's an incredibly powerful and important idea, and it's something that really the universities who are doing that are really finding themselves being able to be more successful in their missions. So basically, research parks are really a good point of beginning for these. They're a tool that universities use to help economic development for their regions and for their local economies. And that is, as Jim, as you talked about, that's really the focus on place. It's creating a place for high-tech economic development. And this works well when there is really a shared focus and a shared commitment, and that's academia, industry, government, where they all are concentrating and they're all working together, and there isn't really one focus on one being overwhelmingly important in the mix. It's where they're all three contributing and sharing their focus. Really, the entire reason for universities to get involved in economic development is this high-tech economic development. It is the job creation, but more so than just entrepreneurship or the job creation idea, it's this very, very high wage job creation. And it's making sure that the competitive advantage of the university is what is focused on. But I would say that even more so, and that is slide 9, Iris, but that is that the idea of advancing knowledge. That's the idea that the universities aren't off in a corner doing their thing and working really, really hard, but being totally unaware of what's going on in industry. When industry and academia work together, that really is a powerful, powerful way to advance knowledge. And I would say that that is an incredibly important reason for universities to work together with economic developers, with industry, and government to make sure that all three are knowing what each other is doing and that they are working cooperatively. So one of the things that's really kind of amazing is that our university research parks, we recently did a study by the Battelle Technology Partnership and really found that there has been a 44% growth in employment in park companies over basically over the time of the recent recession. And as you can see, that would just be an incredible way to really add to the strength of a local economy or regional economy when you have high-tech, high-wage jobs and that jobs that are actually growing in a time of recession. So I would say that with university research parks as being a point of how academia can best work with economic developers, they're going to be basically focused on 3 objectives. And the first one is that they're going to create that environment that encourages innovation. So that environment is really an important part of this. That is that it's not just a bunch of labs that are set out somewhere in a field. It is a holistic environment. It's an environment where people can work really hard, that they can enjoy their life. They can be somewhere where they want to be. They can be somewhere where they're stimulated, basically where they're inspired to create innovation. And that creating that is an incredibly important thing. It's an incredibly difficult thing to really pull off successfully, but very, very powerful when it's done right. One of the main things that offers is industry access, and this is for faculty and students. Not only do faculty or does faculty get the opportunity to engage with industry and thereby help them move along the continuum of advancing their own knowledge, but students and grad students, graduates, have the ability to have companies right there, right next to the university. They can interact with these companies, and they're much better positioned once they graduate to be able to move and transition into the workplace. I would say, though, that one of the main points of academia working with economic developers is the fact that university research parks can serve as an ideal landing pad for industry recruitment. So while you do have your state or your local economic developers are out there working with companies, they're hoping, of course you're going to have startup activity and that kind of stuff, but you also are going to have some recruitment going on. And if you actually have a shovel-ready site that has great university access and that's ready to go, you're going to be really well positioned in the marketplace when you are out there trying to do industry recruitment as an economic developer. So those are some of my initial comments, Jim.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Eileen. Actually, I want to just ask you a follow-up question on one of the goals you talked about with regard to research parks. One of the questions I asked at the open of the program is, how do universities and economic developers kind of identify measures that they're both interested in ways to demonstrate the successes and report on performance. And you said that one of the goals is to create the environment. And what I'm curious about is what your thoughts are with regard to how can economic developers and universities measure that idea of creating an environment. It's, I don't think a lot of folks would look at, creating an environment for innovation and creating an ecosystem as at best an input to innovation. And may not see it as, and may have a difficult time understanding the value of creating the environment. Yet it's probably what we spend most of our time doing in trying to foster innovation. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how do we actually put some measurements around an activity like creating the right kind of environment for innovation?
Well, I think that's really a good question, Jim, and I know that APLU, SciSep, and AURP have been working on this for a long time because there's a lot of different measurements that are out there. The most basic measurement would be economic impact studies, and I think that while they're certainly useful, they really are incomplete, and they're an incomplete, kind of way to measure exactly what's going on. Some of the other things, that maybe that should possibly be included in economic impact as we move forward would be to improve those studies and focus on things like even what is the improvement in graduation rate of students, what is the engagement with internships, things that go across the entire university and really bring in so many more things than just how many jobs were created. And even some of them put in, well, there was like 10 patents that were issued and 5 startups, and those things are really important. But I think that it's really good to take a really, really broad view of the exact impact. And there's a lot of different ways that any university can measure that, along with their university research park. And I would just advise that they take a really broad view of it.
Yeah, well, certainly that's in line with the message that we've tried to give folks. I know that when I've talked with economic developers, though, they'll say, well, we have one metric, it's jobs. And, of course, that's important, and we all want to be focused on that metric, but we also need to remember that there is a connection between the kinds of activities that we do to create the right environment and the actual outcomes. So I think it's a challenge that we both face, universities and economic developers. But that was great, and hopefully we'll come back to some more on this issue of measurement. But right now, I'd like to introduce our next Executive Director for Corporate Engagement, the Corporate Engagement Office at the University of Oklahoma. He's responsible for developing and executing an integrated strategic plan for the university research campus. Sorry, I'm holding on, Iris. Yes.
Jim, sorry if I could just stop you. You keep cutting in and out.
Oh.
Can you make sure that maybe it's just the plug of your headset or something, that it's really putting good? You could just keep coming out in and out, and so we can't hear everything.
Okay. Well, I'll try to let me know if it's happening again, and I have tested the plug on my computer, so let me go back to introducing Cameron, and maybe we can get Cameron's face up there. Cameron McCoy is the Executive Director for the Corporate Engagement Office at the University of Oklahoma. He's responsible for developing and executing an integrated strategic plan for the university research campus. He also supports, coordinates, and integrates research enterprise activities with industry, simplifies external access to OU resources to maximize the impact of the university's capabilities, and expands the engagement pipeline, including current and new relationships, through targeted solutions. In his role at OU, Cameron focuses on growing external relationships with Oklahoma economic development organizations. He's also responsible for marketing and public relations activities related to university economic development efforts, which include the Corporate Engagement Office, the Office of Technology Development, and the university's student-focused Center for the Creation of Economic Wealth. Welcome, Cameron. Thanks a lot for being here.
Jim, thanks. Thank you to everybody who's joined us as well.
Cameron, just a broad question. What's your take on the ways in which universities and economic development professionals can collaborate on shared goals?
It is a broad question, and I'll give you somewhat of a broad answer. With apologies to everybody that there aren't visuals, I'll try to create a visual with my voice here. But I think that first and foremost, economic development professionals and universities have to work together on the local, state, and regional, and perhaps even the national level to really clearly define what universities' roles are in this new economic environment. And we call it economic development, but really what we're talking about is how does the university participate in economic growth? And that even goes to the question you asked, Eileen, about how you measure this, because we're prone to measure things the way we do as universities. A lot of that is on inputs and some of it's on outputs, and economic developers are looking at very different data, and there's somewhere in between that we've got to get to. And so the way that I like to think about this is that as we transition to the university, industry, and government interaction model that Eileen talked about, and away from a nationally prescribed approach, we have to start thinking about innovation focus areas. You could call them pipelines, you can call them districts, you can call them any number of different names, but the reality is that we're trying to figure out this additional new component and expectation of universities. So we have our traditional elements of teaching and research, and now we're being asked to commercialize some of our innovations. But as a newer component of that, we really are now, even more so than ever, responsible for creating the environment and infrastructure that will allow for the absorption of our assets, or our outputs, excuse me, from a regional standpoint. And that's on multiple layers. So to answer your question in sort of a more simplified manner, even though I've droned on here, I think there's really 5 things that universities have to do in partnership with economic developers. We've got to work, number one, towards a defined institutional commitment towards being engaged with economic developers. We have to work to create a sense of place, and Eileen talked a lot about that. And that involves both infrastructure and cultural outputs of the institution. We also have to work together to define a common language, and so that means that we, as an institution, have to understand the language of economic developers related to business recruitment, retention, and expansion. And they've got to understand the way that we measure our activities, or we talk about our activities. The fourth would be the infrastructure investment, and a lot of that has to do, I think, with research parks as a great example, but there are some other mechanisms we can leverage to create the right infrastructure. And then fifth, and probably more importantly, we've got to work in partnership with our economic development counterparts at the local level, at the state level, and the regional level to foster business recruitment, but also business retention and expansion activities. And those are often overlooked by a number of people. Everybody's excited when a big company comes to your state, but we forget about the 200 jobs that we lost because we didn't support a company that was already there. So those are sort of my 5 areas.
That's great, Cameron. I think that's a really good summary. I'll just ask you a quick follow-up on this issue, the last point that you make about universities and economic developers working together. It sounds like to sort of move beyond solely a focus on business recruitment and really start thinking about expansion and really growing the existing base. Is that a hard mindset to change, do you think, among the world of economic developers? Do you feel like recruitment is what economic developers are used to, and so thinking about it, and for that matter, is it a hard mindset to change for universities, or are universities kind of already there?
I think it's not necessarily a mindset change for the players. It's a mindset change for the local media and taxpayers, because everybody gets excited about the new business recruitment efforts and the new jobs that are being created by bringing a new company in, and they get less excited about the fact that you've retained 175 jobs that were about to be lost. There's not as much glory in that. So universities as institutions have to recognize that we've got a role in the recruitment piece, but we also have to maintain and grow our existing efforts around retention and or expansion. And by and large, that's a lot of what we've been doing every year. My friend Brian Darmody likes to say that our biggest economic development activity annually is called graduation. And we've got to make sure that we are aligned as an institution to the growth opportunities of those companies that are in the state and region already. And from an economic developer standpoint, we have to communicate. They've got to communicate regularly with us and sort of cross that barrier to make sure that we are aligned with both their recruitment efforts, but also their retention and expansion efforts.
That's a great point, and I think it's very much in line with, as you know, the Commission on Innovation has for the last number of years been working with our universities to kind of tackle the question of how do we best tell our story, and that's exactly the kind of thing that we come up against is the kinds of stories that maybe are newsworthy or exciting may not be totally in line with the kinds of things that we know create economic growth and opportunity. So it's an interesting challenge, I think, that both universities and economic developers face. So thanks, Cameron. I'd like to introduce our third guest now, and in a few minutes we'll get on to some broader conversation, and I would like to encourage our participants online to share some questions or thoughts that you might have in the chat window, and we'll bring those into the discussion. Diane Palmentera is founder and president of Innovation Associates. She serves on the SciCep Advisory Board, representing the International Economic Development Council, or IEDC, on whose board she sits. And of course, you may or may not know that IEDC is the professional association for economic developers. So Diane is regularly engaged with those folks. And for more than 30 years, she's been a national leader in innovation-based economic development, best known for leveraging universities and federal laboratories to stimulate regional economic competitiveness. Diane has guided federal, state, and local leaders, university presidents, federal labs, and international organizations on innovation, entrepreneurship, technology transfer, commercialization, SBIR, STTR, public-private partnerships, and federal relations. She's provided services and or assessed best practices in numerous states and communities throughout the U.S. and more than 16 countries in Europe, Asia, and Central America. Diane recently served as a co-chair for the 2013 Lab to Market Interagency Summit, sponsored by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and NIH. Thanks so much for being here with us today, Diane.
Thanks very much, Jim, and thanks for the introduction. I'm going to just probably reinforce some of what Eileen and Cameron have already said, in that I think one of the most important roles for economic developers to play is to create an innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem that leverages university resources and creates an environment to foster and retain spin-offs. Now, this does not mean that they focus solely on tech transfer and commercialization, but it does mean that they work with their partners in government, in industry, in the community to, again, create a place where people are going to want to develop businesses, grow businesses, and most importantly, retain businesses. I think, secondly, I believe that economic development organizations can serve as intermediaries or translators between universities and the business community. Now, when I'm using the term economic development organizations, also I want to make it clear that I'm taking a broad brush. Economic development organizations, in the way I view them, can include organizations such as state and local tech organizations and other organizations that serve in an economic development capacity, and that differs somewhat from community to community. We know that universities and the private sector interact on a number of fronts, and they often take different approaches to research and development, to workforce development, job creation, and other areas of common interest. They use different languages, use different measures of success. I believe that one way that we can help in this process and bridge that language and culture gap is to, again, use economic development organizations as brokers, intermediaries, and translators. We also need to help connect the dots by providing linkages among technology, community, and workforce development resources throughout the community and throughout the region, and economic developers, that is their job to do so. In terms of promoting university resources, economic development organizations can both promote universities as critical players in economic development and in the success in their successes, and through advertising and media events, awards, and in many different ways.
Great, thank you, Diane. That's a great overview of how economic developers can work with universities. It sounds like, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is just sort of that the roles of universities in economic development have changed a lot over the last number of years. And I wanted to ask you about how economic developers' jobs have changed too, and whether these changes in both the university roles and economic developer roles have complement each other. And I still want to ask this, but I just also wanted to note that it's interesting that you've talked about how the idea of what an economic developer is or an economic development organization is has also changed, and that it's probably expanded quite a bit in the last number of years. And we now think of different kinds of organizations, including governmental and quasi-governmental organizations, as being economic developers. So I guess, maybe you could talk a little bit about how well the shifts in the profession of economic with or don't align with the way that we think of universities playing a role in economic development.
Yeah, that is correct. I think the economic development organizations and the roles of economic developers have changed considerably over the years. And that, before, I think, as Cameron mentioned, economic developers focused primarily on attracting business and industry to the community or the region. And that has changed. While they still do quite a bit of that and still focus on that somewhat, they also are focusing more on creating those opportunities to grow innovation and entrepreneurial businesses. And to, again, retention. I think we need to be spending a lot more focus on and time on retention of businesses and communities as well. But yes, the economic development organizations themselves have expanded. The state technology organizations and community technology organizations, Pennsylvania's Innovation Works in Pittsburgh, and all of the state tech organizations, I see as definitely part of the whole universe of economic development organizations. I think also what we're seeing is that we're going from narrowly defined economic development vision that where we're trying to link a wider range of community workforce development, quality of place, manufacturing, environmental, a number of different factors that we need to be bringing together and connecting in a more coherent way that then again creates that ecosystem. I think there's also a recognition that universities are a major economic asset, and that we need to leverage and that we need to really focus on much more. Also, I think that there is a need, though, for economic developers and economic development organizations to better understand the inner workings and goals of the universities. I think that they do not really fully grasp, especially the mysteries of how one navigates and where universities often really are coming from, especially in dealing with private sector interactions. And we focus, as you know, a lot on tech transfer and commercialization, and I think there is a movement to broaden that and to look at wider partnerships between private sector and public sector and universities in the private sector, and not so narrowly define that whole field of tech transfer and commercialization anymore. I think that also there's an evolving role of university economic developers as well, where they realize that they are have a much greater role in community and regional convening, where they are more proactive in their linkages with a wider range of external organizations and resources. They also are having increasing involvement internally with other units that do corporate outreach, again, tech transfer and commercialization, entrepreneurial development, their incubators, their research parks, and actually we need to continue doing a better job of linking all those within the university as well as to externally to external sources. I think in some universities also we're seeing increased visibility and recognition of economic development within the universities, but in others there's still a need to, I believe, elevate economic development to a higher level and to have economic developers be provided with greater support and access.
Yeah, it's great. Just a quick response to a couple of those things that you mentioned, Diana. First of all, you mentioned how economic developers will do well to get a better understanding of how we work inside our universities, how things happen, and what our goals are. Cameron mentioned a little bit about this as well, that there needs to be better understanding perhaps in both directions. And I think that's very true. And in particular, when you talk about that intermediary role that economic developers can play and translating goals and opportunities between business and industry, government, and universities, it's so important that we all understand each other better. And you also pointed out how just as we're expecting these innovation ecosystems to kind of be created around universities, you mentioned how universities really need to link up better perhaps within the institution in order to make resources available in a timely way and in a way that works for our partners. And I think that's an incredibly important point that, I said at our SciSep meeting last week in San Diego that universities should be thinking about how can they be the ecosystems that they want to see in the world. How can they become an ecosystem just as they're trying to be part of their local ecosystems? And it seems like that's a really important thing for universities to think about as they think about partnering with economic developers and others. So these are great points. I'd like to open up the conversation now and get others engaged. Definitely want to get our participants, all of you who've logged in to listen to us today. I'd love to get you involved in the conversation too. So just a quick reminder that all you have to do is to join the conversation is type your question or thoughts into the chat window. We'd love to hear about some of your experiences with university economic development partnerships. And I see we've got a couple of those questions already, and I'm going to get to those in just a second. First, I just wanted to follow up on this measurement issue that came up when we were talking with Eileen, and I'd love to get your thoughts, Diane, and yours, Cameron, about this issue of measuring, and how do we find measures that are of common interest that we can work together to realistically collect data. And I think another piece of thinking about how we measure our accomplishments in economic development is how can we find measures that aren't I guess misleading, for lack of a better word. How can we make sure that we're finding measurements that really help the public understand the really kind of the truth about economic development and how it works? And so Cameron, I'll start with you on that question.
Wow, that's a challenging question because there's really two components to that. The part you mentioned here about the public understanding it, really that's, I think, in part, and Diane can agree, and Eileen maybe as well, or disagree, but I think that's why we always relate economic development to jobs, because that's the easiest thing to understand. But the way that I actually like to think about how we ought to start measuring this has really to do with looking at outputs and inputs. And so I think we have a responsibility to really start focusing on the quality of the inputs into our anchor institutions. And so that's K through 12 activity and the relationship between economic development or growth and those inputs into the institution. And then on the output side, as we relate universities and their involvement with economic developers, I actually think we need to start thinking about the effects of our efforts. And so we should be thinking about measuring the regional absorption effect, or how many of our students and organizations are we retaining. We ought to look at the productivity effect, and so how are we increasing productivity in our region, and so there are a number of different indicators of that. And then we ought to be looking at a cultural effect, which would have a lot to do with the arts, but also having to do with social equality. And then fourth, and probably very relevant to our modern economy, is looking at a technology catch-up effect. In other words, how quickly are we innovating in our businesses, and what is the impact of the university's effort related to that? And so those, I think, are a little more traditional economist metrics.
Mm-hmm.
But when you think about the way that a university works towards teaching and training, doing new knowledge creation, commercializing technologies, and then investing in regional absorption capacities, those to me seem like really interesting indicators of whether or not this is working. And of course, all that calls down to jobs retained and jobs created as well.
Great points, Cameron. And Diane, I'd like to ask you the same question. And one of the things I'm wondering if you could focus on is this, Cameron points out a variety of different kinds of measures. And I guess, given your work with economic developers, are the kinds of things that Cameron is talking about already of interest to economic developers, or is it both universities and economic developers that need to kind of get a new way of thinking about measuring? Or are these things that economic developers can actually help universities think about because they've already been thinking about these sorts of measures for a long time?
Well, I think economic developers have been thinking about them for a long time, but I think we're all scratching our heads a little bit on how we do metrics that are really show value, and I think value is a key word here. In terms of, I think when you look at metrics and measures of success, we need to be looking at what audiences are we looking at. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it's just a fact of life, is that a lot of times we're looking at the state legislators, and we're looking, as a university, you're looking to make sure that you're providing a return on investment for the state's investment in the universities. And so how do you do that? That is one reason I think that we focus so much on job creation and jobs, because a lot of times that's what state legislators are looking for. But I think that we do have to broaden this out. I think that more and more there's a realization that universities are also resources to spin out businesses. I, from an economic development standpoint, don't look at patents, and I know that the universities themselves focus a lot on patents and numbers of articles written, scientific articles. From an economic development standpoint, you want to know how many businesses were able to be spun off, how they've grown, how productive they are, how much revenue they're bringing in, how many jobs they've created, etc. I think there are a lot of, we need to be looking at this in a much broader sense too. You have public-private partnerships and exchanges that don't immediately show any growth in jobs or growth in revenue, but over the long term can really lead to tremendous growth and value. So one major thing is you need to be looking at long-term and long-term measures, and none of us do that in economic development or university. I'll just stop there and let others.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Diane. I think that's a great point about the long-term measures, because, and I think not only are long-term measures difficult for us to capture the data about, I think it's also really hard for whether it's the public or our state legislators, perhaps particularly state legislators, to understand those long-term impacts. And so it's almost like we have two levels of education we need to do. One is the metrics, but also helping people understand that the path between the activities that we undertake, whether it's as universities or economic developers, and the outputs, the outcomes that we want, like jobs, is not necessarily always a direct or a quick path, right? So we have to help people understand that. So thank you for those ideas about measurement. It's, as some folks might know, metrics and measurement has been a key area of interest for our commission for a number of years, and it's great to get your perspectives on that. We have a question from Appalachian State University, I think is a great question to throw to you, Eileen, and that is, do we have examples of virtual research parks that get started before the capital is available for things like new buildings and infrastructure? Can universities have the same kind of impact that they have with a physical research park, with in a startup kind of way, but in a more virtual way?
Well, Jim, that's a good question, because really, when you look at the idea of creating an environment of innovation, that idea is the creation of a place. So all research parks are going to be on a continuum, and they're going to be on the continuum of the idea of the research park, and then versus the actual manifestation of a fabulous place for innovation that includes live, work, play, and you know, exciting, inspirational events and things like that. But of course, everybody has to get started somewhere. One of the things that I would say that from a university standpoint is that the corporate engagement needs to be ramped up. You know, as you move forward into the creation of the place and creation of a research park, in the beginning, it probably will be virtual or just relationship building with corporations. And I know that one of our friends even he works for University of Maryland, and he had a business card printed up that says he's Director of Corporate Happiness. Basically, making sure that businesses are working well with your university is the first step in the creation of the place for your region or your you know, locality. And so I would say that there's kind of beginning to make those steps is really an important point. And then at some point, probably early on in the process, the creation of the resources to start the park will manifest itself. You know, if you basically just start doing this, start engaging with corporations with the idea that you are going to be creating the place of innovation, then that is going to really help you to move along the line and develop more rapidly.
That's great. I love that. Director of Corporate Happiness. I think that, you know, we should be thinking about that in general, and just sort of, you know, being director of ecosystem happiness, and thinking about how do we make sure that all of the partners in our ecosystem are getting what they want from the relationships, and also feeling good about the contributions that they're making. So I think that's a great way to put it. Cameron, I know you work with the research park there at OU, and I was wondering whether you had any thoughts in particular on this idea of virtual.
Yeah, I do actually. A couple of different thoughts. And Eileen very nicely touched on the corporate engagement piece. I think that's an essential element. And I think Diane also mentioned that we have to have translators or people who can speak the language of both worlds and help navigate the institution and vice versa. So that corporate engagement piece is essential, but you have to have a defined institutional commitment to that effort. And also, as Eileen noted, that building that sense of place. You know, I think the question is, do you have any examples of virtual research parks? And I'm not sure that I have any specific examples, but I would suggest taking a look at what Virginia Commonwealth did as they integrated themselves into the fabric of the downtown area. From an economic development standpoint. But the latter part of that question is really what strikes me, and that is that the part about the capital being available for new buildings and or infrastructure. And I think it's an important point to note that if you are really aligned and in collaboration with your local economic development organizations, both parties can really benefit from maximizing funding opportunities that we may not have maximized before. So a university could work with an EDO to go chase after some EDA funding, and or we could work towards research contract leverage to create infrastructure that wasn't there before. And so I think a lot of institutions and a lot of EDOs aren't really aware of the different funding mechanisms and don't bring each other into the fold that make that capital available much sooner than it otherwise would be. But if you can create that idea, that commitment to building a sense of place and working closely with industry and government, then you can go after the funding.
Great points, I think, and you know, I think some of this conversation actually leads to another question that we've gotten from David Conrad at the University of Iowa, and his question is, you know, what do we think the university, what do we think that university research parks, in quotations, parks, will evolve into in 5 to 10 years? And David also notes that it seems that the traditional business model for parks seems to be really outdated, and perhaps has been for a number of years now. It sounds like our thinking about what a research park is evolving, and maybe what its role is evolving. And again, I'll just start with you, Eileen, given your role with the Association of University Research Parks. What are your thoughts about this in terms of what are they going to look like in 5 to 10 years? How is that different from what they've looked like for a number of years now? And is the business model outdated? I mean, do we need to be developing a new one for research parks?
Well, what I'm going to say is that I think that if you really define traditional research park and you start thinking about what Research Triangle Park used to be 50 years ago and maybe Stanford Research Park, this, was a really incredibly risky idea to have businesses working with universities, working with government. That was something that was, just revolutionary. Well, since that time, and especially I would say in the past 10 years, it's not been so much revolutionary as evolutionary. And the business models and the basically the idea of what a research park is and does has been evolving. And I would say that now one of the most important parts that a research park plays, as it will in the future, 5 to 10 years, is that of anchor institution, working alongside the university to be part of innovation districts, part of creating the place, and being really the heart of it, being the convener, being the, the reason, the inspiration for creating really, very effective, very good places that people want to move to, businesses want to be there, and that create a lot of positive economic development. I think that that is really the thing. It's working together collaboratively. It is an outgrowth of the start and the germination, which maybe was a traditional research park, germinating into working with accelerators, working with local incubators, working with economic development organizations, and even as Cameron points out, and I think it's incredibly important, with different arts groups and different organizations in the community to really create that.
Yeah, and I think,
Cameron, maybe you have some thoughts on that too.
I'm just going to jump in here, Eileen, real quick, and note that as you talk about kind of how we think differently about the business model, what I've also noticed is that research parks look very different more and more these days. I know that, for example, the model of the Knowledge City, which I think is what they call their park at the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. I might have that wrong, but the idea of a knowledge city, that a research park is a city unto itself and has things like residential and retail kinds of operations within it. And I think that's one interesting way in which what research parks look like is different, and really underscores the idea that development of place is important in the equation. But something else that you mentioned, Eileen, I wanted to ask Diane about, which you mentioned the idea of innovation districts, which is a fairly new phrase to me. I don't think I've been hearing innovation districts so much before. I know just a couple weeks ago, Brookings released a report about innovation districts. So maybe because we've introduced this new phrase, Diane, maybe you could talk a little bit about how is the idea of innovation districts different from kind of one of the traditional ways of thinking about economic development. The business of economic development has been cluster development. Is innovation districts just the same thing in a new, is it old wine in new bottles, or is the idea of developing innovation districts fundamentally different from developing clusters? And what do those shifts mean for how universities and economic developers work together?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Innovation districts are different from clusters, and I'm just going to use Brookings and Bruce Katz over at Brookings are are the people promoting this concept. And for those who are not aware, innovation districts are geographic areas where there are anchor institutions and companies that are clustered and connected with startups, incubators, accelerators, etc., and where they're also physically in a compacted area where there's transit, there's a mix of housing, offices, retail, etc. I think that there's some overlap between clusters and innovation districts, and I think that innovation districts can have clusters, and so there's some overlap here. But I think we know that when various factors are connected, that it creates a more powerful whole. The sum of the parts being, bigger than the whole. And what we need to realize is that venture capital, mentoring, and a lot of the types of things that go into creating an innovation ecosystem do better when there is physical proximity. We know this from a lot of various studies. So a number of urban areas are doing this kind of thing. I mean, we find that around Georgia Tech has for many years tried to develop that technology area right at the university that has involved ATDC, its primary incubator being right there, and other infrastructure that they have built in very close proximity to the university itself. And that has been very successful. And also we know that Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, they have been active in developing that sort of, I don't know, Eileen, you may catch me on this, but kind of a virtual research park in the Oakland area of Pittsburgh. St. Louis has been doing some of this. A number of cities are focused on developing innovation type district areas. And no, I think it is a new wave, and I think it's healthy. It focuses on university as an anchor and creating that innovation and entrepreneurial system that we talk so much about.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Diana. It's clear that we need to be thinking differently all the time, because all of the things that we work around, the technology that we're working around, the way in which economic development happens, these things are all changing. So I think, we need to get used to change, whether we're economic developers or we're universities. We need to get used to changing the way we think about our approaches and about sort of the manifestation of the work that we do. So we're actually almost out of time, but what I'd love to do is get one more question in, because we have a question from Terry Woodworth. And Cameron, I think I'm going to direct this question at you. Terry asks, he says that having worked for a state TBED organization, or technology-based economic development, he's interested where the private sector can play a role in facilitating university, industry, and community ecosystems. So Cameron, you work with folks in the private sector all the time. What thoughts do you have about what their role is in this job of creating the ecosystem?
Okay, great. And I'll go as fast as I can, recognizing our shortage of time here, but it's a great question. I think there's really two components to this. And the first one has to do with the private sector on a state, regional, and national level, and maybe even international level, thinking about themselves as a holistic partner with universities. And so that means let's think about how we can engage together on research and innovation. Let's understand how we transfer knowledge, whether that's continuing education or undergraduate education, or knowledge creation as it relates to IP generation. Let's understand how we work together to facilitate technology commercialization, whether that's through SBIR, STTR, or technology licensing, or a regional location. And then it's also about the other traditional interplays with an institution. So whether that's a giving component or a community engagement component, I think those are essential for the private sector to really understand and invest in a relationship in a meaningful way that is as holistic and beneficial to both parties as possible. And the other area is to really think about, and maybe this goes back to the business model question, but to understand how the private sector can invest in the infrastructural assets. And so if you think about research parks, a number of research parks are now doing long-term land leasing with the private sector to develop the parks and engage with the local institution, but then go out and recruit tenants to those research parks. And in part that happens when you have a state institution that can't necessarily invest the capital right away. So I think the private sector does play a big part in the development of the ecosystem from a physical infrastructure standpoint, but also an intellectual capital standpoint.
Great. That's a great answer, Cameron, and I think echoes a lot of what we've talked about today. That what I take away from today's conversation is that it's all about thinking differently. All of us need to be, whether it's universities or economic developers, the government, the private sector, we all need to be thinking differently about our roles here, and we need to be open to evolving models and evolving approaches. So I want to thank all three of you for being here today to discuss this with me. Thanks very much, Cameron, for being here. Eileen and Diane, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Jim.
So
thank you, Jim.
Thanks again. As we close out here, I wanted to say, first of all, thanks as well to all of you who've logged in and joined us for the webinar today. If you're not familiar with APLU and its Commission on Innovation, Competitiveness, and Economic Prosperity, I would encourage you to come and learn more about us. Follow us on Twitter at APLU Innovation. There's a link here also to a LinkedIn group that we have set up, and we have occasional conversation, often sparked by Eileen Walker at our LinkedIn group. And there's my email address as well, and I welcome hearing from any of you, and I'd love to tell you more about the work of the Commission. And I'd also like to invite you to consider joining us for the next Social Capital. We're going to take the summer off, but we'll be back in September. And on Thursday, September 18th, we're going to have a program called Civic and Social Engagement, Why Community Development Partnerships Matter. We've talked a little bit about, the role of universities beyond developing innovation and entrepreneurship and moving into creating great communities. And Eva Klein from the University Economic Development Association, and also Eva Klein and Associates, and President Lloyd Jacobs from the University of Toledo are going to join us for that conversation about community development. So we look forward to having you join us for that discussion on September 18th. Again, just a final thank you to everybody for being with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next Social Capital. Thanks.